Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I think we'll all make a start. If you could finish your conversations, please. Thank you so much for coming. We're a bit ahead of schedule, so that's great. It gives us more time for discussion and debate. So my name's Meredith. I'm chair of the Fellowship Science Advisory Panel, and I'm really pleased to be hosting this panel discussion today. I'm sure we're up for an hour and a half of very lively debate. So this session is about preparedness for disease outbreaks. I'm really thinking about what our role as vets is in that preparedness and our role as vets in the delivery of the One Health agenda. I really hope you enjoyed the talks this morning. I think that really set the scene very well for thinking about disease preparedness, not just infectious disease, but all diseases in very much that sort of One Health context. So we have a very esteemed panel here today. I feel very lowly compared to my esteemed colleagues here, and I will be very pleased to introduce them to you one by one. So on my right, on your left, we have Professor James Wood. I'm sure all our panel members are quite familiar to you all, but I'll introduce them all. James is Professor of Equine and Farm Animal Science at the University of Cambridge. He's a veterinary epidemiologist working on infectious diseases. He's also, as we heard this morning, become recently the Vice Chair of the Fellowship Board. And James works mainly on emerging infectious diseases in Africa, particularly bovine tuberculosis globally. So welcome, James. Next we have Dr. Tiffany Henning. Tiffany is an epidemiologist with a particular interest in animal welfare. She was a trustee of the Animal Welfare Foundation from early 2007, becoming a trustee 2011 to 2016. Tiffany had a 20-year army career where she worked widely in human healthcare planning and chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear defense policy, strategy and planning, as well as working with military working animals. Tiffany sat on the advisory committee on dangerous pathogens from 2013 to 2023. And latterly, Tiffany has worked for the NHS, including running the COVID vaccination programme for a population of 7 million people in the east of England from August 20 to March 2022. Tiffany became an RCVS Fellow in 2023. Tiffany's sitting here, and welcome to Tiffany. Thank you. To my right is Professor Fiona Tomlin. Fiona is Professor of Experimental Parasitology at the RVC. Since 2019, as Director of the UK RI-funded GCRF One Health Poultry Hub, she's experienced research leadership on a global scale, forging cross-sector collaborations to address challenges linked to rapid intensification of chicken meat and egg production, particularly in low and middle income settings, and the need to reduce the risk to human and animal health from zoonotic pathogens and antimicrobial resistance. Thank you for coming, Fiona. And to my left is Dr. David Black. David is Senior Director of Paragon Veterinary Group, a 3-centre, 32-vet, fiercely independent, mixed rural practice vet practice in Cumbria. He's founder, director and treasurer of Vet Sustain and managing director of Vet Salus, a business initiative developing livestock vet collaboration and consultancy globally. He's been an RCVS Fellow since 2020, and David is passionate about vet-led business, global veterinary collaboration, One Health, and veterinary sustainability. Welcome, David. Thank you. Okay, so the way we're going to run the session this afternoon is I'm going to start off by posing a few questions to you as an audience, and we just want to start off with a show of hands. And I'll ask those questions in a minute. Then I'm going to be going through the panel, asking specific questions to each panel member to really set the scene for the rest of the afternoon and our discussions. So as we go through those processes, really start to think about how this impacts you, your role in this whole area of disease preparedness and delivery of One Health. So just by way of setting the scene, how many of you, just a show of hands, feel that in your current day-to-day work you are actively engaged with One Health? Just a show of hands. I would say that's probably about 90%. Okay, thank you. And again, just a show of hands, how many of you feel that in your current day-to-day work, you're actively engaged with disease outbreak preparedness? A lot less of you, but still probably, I would say, about 40%. And this final question, do you believe you have anything to contribute to planning for disease outbreaks, you as individuals?
Put your hand up.
Again, I'd say about 40%, 30 to 40%. Okay, so those three questions, just be mulling that over, because at the end of the session, I'd like to ask some questions again and think if you've changed your mind, perhaps, or perhaps realise that you do have more or could have more of a role to play. So, as I mentioned, I'm now going to ask each panel member a specific question, and they'll talk for about 5 minutes or so in answer to that question. And I hope that will hopefully stimulate questions to ask them in the second half of the debate and make you think about this important area. So I'm going to start with you, James, if I may. So, James, I know you're really interested in pandemic emergence and how we can reduce the likelihood of new pandemics emerging. What do you see from your work and experience as the greatest challenges in this space?
Thanks, Anna, and of course I've not had sight of this question at all. So if I'm badly prepared, it's just my own fault. I think the point I'd like to emphasise to start with, thinking about prevention of pandemics, and I think we all understand inherently and specifically why pandemics are important to try and prevent if we possibly can in this room. I'm going to say no one, and that obviously doesn't mean no one, but really the global direction of policy at the moment is not around pandemic prevention. It's about rapid response. We hear we've got to have a vaccine within 100 days. We've got to have a health system that can detect infections early on, and a suite of really important, very clearly thought through measures that will and should be able to mitigate the impact of most pandemics. But actually no one is really thinking collectively, that there aren't people that are thinking collectively about how to deal with pandemic prevention. And so obviously if we're thinking about prevention, then you've got to think what the drivers are. And there's a nice parallel with the way that I think we should be thinking about this and the guest lecturer this morning. Because one of the greatest drivers of pandemic emergence of new infectious diseases are human-mediated land use changes, which, in contrast to some of the things that we heard about happening in Scotland, which were pretty positive, in most cases this involves a loss of biodiversity. And a lot of this stuff is driven by extractive industries. And that includes mining, and actually nickel and cobalt for batteries is a major problem globally in this respect. But also agriculture is an important driver of this. And actually some of the least efficient, probably in some ways rather undesirable aspects of agricultural development around the world, such as a good bad example is beef production in the Amazon basin, which has been a huge driver of biodiversity loss. And actually no one is talking about linking these with the needs for a global approach in terms of how to reduce this driver of biodiversity loss. This is made worse in this kind of general space by the fact that our general responses to pandemics in terms of early detection and early response are driven by the WHO's vehicles, so the International Health Regulations, now nearly 20 years old in their current draft, and the draft Pandemic Treaty, which actually reasonably there's been a lot of pushback from a lot of low and middle income countries. Now, all of these leave the responsibility for what goes on in their shores in their hands. And the problem in this context is that a lot of pandemics are expected to arise in a lot of tropical countries, low and middle income countries. There's a major cost associated with the sort of preventive measures or the stopping of extraction that I think that, or mitigating how that extraction is dealt with. And we through these vehicles, expect low middle income countries to pay for prevention of pandemics, which are going to most benefit us in high income countries. So the global health in particular, inequalities, and I'd say iniquities, actually being driven by, in an unintended way, by the sort of policies that are being taken forward in this approach. A One Health approach promoting environmental, animal and human health should form, I believe, the basis for pandemic prevention. And at the moment, I don't believe, outside of a few research projects, anything's happening at an intergovernmental level to really make this happen. And I think that, for me, is one of the greatest challenges in this space. And then we layer on top of it some ridiculously insane human behaviours, like continuing to move live, particularly wildlife species, but animals, long distances in suboptimal conditions, putting aside welfare. In terms of disease emergence, this is bonkers and we should be doing something about it, but we're not. Thank you.
Thank you, James. A lot to unpack there. Thank you. Yeah, I really like the, not thinking so much about preparedness, but prevention and getting to the core of it. Thank you. Fiona, I'd like to ask you a question, please. So you've had 4 decades of microbiological research into animal pathogens. So it must have been quite a change to lead a multidisciplinary GCRF One Health poultry hub. What are the key lessons from that life experience that you've had to date?
Yes, thank you, Anna. I'd just like to say I completely agree with James's sort of analysis. But what I'm going to talk about is a bit more personal, I guess, and what's happened. So I guess, when I came into this hub, which was a complete change from what I'd been doing before, of course, I'm very well aware that things like pandemic preparedness, prevention, antimicrobial resistance are complex challenges and are going to require solutions and mitigations that cannot possibly be delivered by a single kind of technical discipline or intervention regulation. But I think I probably had the attitude that really wasn't my concern, that I was very focused on doing my bit of research and somebody else would be looking after the other things. And I think what I've come to recognise very strongly is that absolutely that isn't the case, that I feel very passionately now that we all have a responsibility. And it's not enough just to think, oh, well, I'm doing really good research or I'm a great practitioner or whatever it is. It's about pushing ourselves out of our comfort zones and thinking much more about how we can learn to understand and respect the strengths of other disciplines, to think about how we can have sensible lines of communication so that we can even begin to understand the methodologies that other disciplines apply and what we can learn from that and how that can take us to places where we hadn't really thought that we would be able to go. So working with social scientists, for example, has been very challenging, quite uncomfortable a lot of the time. Thinking, what are you talking about? I don't understand, and trying to communicate. But, it's also very invigorating as well as being uncomfortable. And I guess something that I've learned as well is that these approaches take time, they take investment. I'm talking from a research perspective, but I think it's not just that. I mean, learning to work across sectors, to have people who can understand how to talk to people from different fields and communicate concerns, etc., and be able to, write and speak clearly to policymakers or to industries and communicate where the challenges are and the practical changes that need to be made is really important. So time is really key. Stability. You need to be able to have trusted partnerships and networks if you're going to get things done, be able to discuss things freely and work out how you can share the planning and design of your experiments. In my case, in other people, it wouldn't just be experiments, but it might be development of tools, etc. And how do we advocate clearly for evidence-based changes in policy with the people who can do that? I think One Health sometimes people feel quite scared because they feel that it's a dilution of their own discipline-based expertise, and I've learned very clearly that's not the case. We're not expecting people to change their expertise. It's about learning how you can work with other people, collaborating, etc. And I think, on the sort of practical side, when it comes to thinking about AMR and pandemics, or epizootic emergence, there's often a focus of attention on what is seen as hotspots, of animal-human contact, or slaughterhouses, live markets, or meat processing plants, etc., or at wild domestic interfaces. And we're really great at technical analysis of pathogens. UK was leading the world with COVID sequencing and understanding transmission, etc. But except at times when we're really facing a crisis, I would say there's very little resource that's going into looking at source attribution or trying to analyse the practices and behaviours of the people in the production chains, or in the, whether it's the logging industry, or whether it's the food production, fodder production industry, or whether it's working in the livestock industry. All these practices that are driving the epidemiological risk, there's very little that goes on here. When it comes to the policy side, or the advice side, I'd say that, globally, there's no shortage of reports and national action plans, roadmaps from, agencies and governments with sort of, advice and instructions about how we can improve surveillance or increase biosecurity or reduce antimicrobials or have better vaccine uptake. But there's this massive gap when it comes to how you can practically prepare and implement, particularly, how do you engage the public? How do we understand what people think, what their attitudes are, and certainly what's acceptable to communities, very disparate communities working across different industries. And I think a lot of the interventions that we see really do reflect that we don't really think about disease emergence in the context of food systems and structures and the way in which risk is built up and how it can be assessed and mitigated in the context, very diverse context within which much of the global food is prepared. Particularly, we've been working in Asia, in South Asia and Southeast Asia, where vast amounts of poultry production and the growth of that industry is exponential, and it's happening in a very fragile and unstable manner, and risk is enormous. So I think these are the sort of learnings that I've got. Some of them are applicable in the UK, some of them are not. But as James said, we're a global village. What's happening in Dhaka will be affecting Norfolk in 3 weeks' time or something, and vice versa. So I think that's what I've taken away from 5.5 years.
Thank you. Excellent answer. Thank you. Again, lots to unpack there, and food for thought. I think, thinking about, I think the common theme there is obviously it's people and communication, isn't it?
It's people, yeah.
People, which echoes what was said this morning.
It's not the animal's fault.
Thank you very much. David, I'll come to you next. So as a practitioner and an advocate for sustainability, how do you feel this overlaps with One Health, and what do you think that veterinary professionals can do in their daily work to make a difference?
Okay, thank you, Anna. Quite a searching question. If I put my Vet Sustain hat on, and all credit to Laura Hyam, who set up Vet Sustain some 5 years ago, and I've been very pleased and honoured to support her in that journey. I think we all know, don't we, that time's running out now for the planet, and we're either going to have to stabilise and hopefully reverse climate change, and at the same time feed the population. I had a statistic the other day, I think it came from Megan Clark in Australia, that said that we're going to have to produce as much food in the next 50 years as we've already produced as far back as human civilization goes. So let's say 10,000 years. We've got to produce the same amount in the next 50. So we've got a job of work to do to feed the planet at the same time as being sustainable. And it's a very complex thing. We heard from Peter this morning, haven't we, how complex sustainability is. And when we set up Vet Sustain, we looked at the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, and we looked at those and we thought, well, what would the veterinary sustainability goals be? And we sort of distilled that down into 6, which is now much easier to remember by the 6 Ws, which our chair, Ed Bailey, came up with. So it's always a risk, isn't it, when you've got a list and you try and remember it, but it should be fairly straightforward. So we've got welfare, which is the animal side of it. We've got well-being from the human aspects. We've got warming. We've got waste, water and wildlife, not in any particular order, but we've got the 6 Ws, and I think that's what we have to think about every day. As a profession, we are very fortunate, I believe, that we sit right at the intersection of human health, veterinary health, animal health, environmental health. We're in that little part of the Venn diagram, and there's very few people work in that space. And I think we have to be very aware of our opportunity to do stuff within that space and the social license that we have. We tend to be, as professionals, embedded in our local communities. We can be leading in our local communities, and we can be advocating for change. And I think it's a privileged position, but it's also a very powerful position to be in. Everything we do as vets, I'm a livestock vet largely at heart, but everything we do is related to sustainability. If I take my livestock vet hat on, we just haven't called it sustainability. Everything we've done to improve animal health, longevity, breeding healthier animals, reducing the use of veterinary medicines, etc., we've been doing that for quite a long time, but we haven't called it sustainability. We haven't looked at it through that lens. And one of my pet hates, you heard from Peter this morning, one of his pet hates. One of my pet hates is when people say, we've got to get farmers started on this journey. Well, farmers have been on this journey for generations. I don't know a single farmer that doesn't care about wildlife or the hedgerows or the environment. But they haven't called it sustainability, or they haven't called it regen, or they haven't called it rewilding. So we're not starting on this journey, we're progressing along that journey. So there's a lot we can do, I think, as advocates. If I then put my practice hat on, and we've already heard James talk about it this morning, about identifying disease. This is about disease preparedness, this session, not just about infectious disease, I don't believe. I think we've still got endemic disease to think about, and we've got diseases that are going to be becoming more important depending on climate change. So things like vector-borne diseases are going to move. We're going to have things like heat stress, which is going to play a part. So there's other diseases that we're going to have to prepare ourselves for as the climate changes. But as James touched on, we have to identify those diseases when they appear. And one of my concerns as a practitioner, and I was very highly involved with foot and mouth over 20 years ago now, is that these diseases, these emerging diseases, tend to get picked up by vets in practice who are working with the state veterinary service or the local laboratories, whoever that might be. And it worries me that we're losing our connectedness between the practitioners in the field who are seeing animals every day and those who may be actually collating the evidence to say we've got something new popping up. So we have to know what the background noise of disease is before we know when something new pops up, and then, as James says, react to it. And I think we also have to make sure that we're working and building and rebuilding those bridges with the likes of the State Veterinary Service, so that in the event of an exotic disease incursion, we are able to respond quickly. It still worries me that we may not be able to respond as quickly as we need to as an industry if we do have another disease outbreak like foot and mouth. And I'm not sure that we always know what the policy is if we have a new disease coming in and found. I'm not sure that we know exactly what the policy is going to be. Is it going to be least loss of life? Is it going to be a return to international trade? Is it going to be least disruption to the tourism industry? What policy are we working with? Because until we know that, we're not going to know which way to direct ourselves. Thank you. Thank you.
Excellent answer, David. And again, I'm sure this will spark lots of questions from the floor. And hopefully you'll now, if you weren't already aware of the 6 Ws. I think that's a great way of just capturing that important concept. So finally, last but not least for this section, Tiffany, coming to you. So as an epidemiologist yourself with a real interest in animal welfare, how do you see One Health and how do you see the veterinary profession engaging practically for the widest benefit?
Okay, so moving on from James, who started with pandemic prevention, I'm going to talk a bit more about how we might prepare ourselves for the next pandemic. And starting with David's description of vet sustain and the 6 Ws, which I think is excellent, he talks about animal welfare and human well-being being two sides of the same coin. One Health really includes the well-being of all species, which is definitely a life worth living for everyone. So, as you might imagine, my focus is taking an animal welfare perspective when we're looking at preventing and managing a significant disease outbreak. Traditionally, we just think about how do we stop the disease outbreak. So, Fiona talked about a multidisciplinary approach. Where do vets fit in here. Now, I think you'd all agree there's no such thing as a crystal ball. We can't tell what's coming tomorrow, next week, next year. What we can do is know that something is coming, and we might have an idea of what the options are of what those things might be. So, for example, David talked about the moving of the range of vectors due to climate change. So, for example, you're probably aware that Aedes albopictus has been found in the UK, has overwintered for the first time, and is a competent vector for a wide range of viruses. And whilst it prefers humans, it's quite happy to bite many species, including mammals and birds. So is a competent vector and could cause us a problem in the future if it managed to get a real foothold into the country. So we really do have to think about a wide range of different diseases, not just the expected influenza. And we also have to think about the species that we might have to consider. So not just traditional food-producing animals and foot and mouth disease, but what happens if we get diseases in our pet population, for example? How might we approach this? So with my military background, I would definitely think about possible scenarios. We call this red teaming, trying to think about what's the worst case scenario that might happen, what experiences might we need to think about in terms of the sequelae that could happen if that event happened. So for that, ideally, we'd get a whole diversity of experience and skills from different people talking together in what's called a Delphi. Or for those of you that are not so young, do you remember Dungeons and Dragons? And you say you get to one point and it says go to page 38, go to page 46, etc. That's a bit like how you can do thinking about scenario planning. We could also pull in potential control points in time and space in this imaginary outbreak. You can almost think about hazard analysis, critical control points. What happens at this point, and what's the implication not just for the disease, but what's the implication also for animal welfare and human well-being? And what might we be able to bring in at that point that could address that at the same time as managing the disease and trying to prevent that from causing a particular problem? And let's be open, that the diseases that we're concerned about are diseases of economic importance, which is why foot and mouth disease was so important, but also diseases with zoonotic potential or that predominantly affect humans and human health. So we really need to think about how we safeguard welfare when pre-planning possible action versus in the midst of an outbreak and thinking on the hoof, when it's much harder to think about the potential implications of any decisions that you're making on animal welfare. While you might think you're taking the best decision at the time, given a bit more time, you might make a slightly different decision. So being able to pull people together, I think, is absolutely critical. And I think the fellowship has a real role to play in red teaming potential disease outbreaks within human or animal or a combination of the two, and to think about how we might, as a profession, best be able to safeguard health and well-being of both humans and animals within a One Health context. We might think we have an automatic seat around the table as the veterinary profession in an outbreak. That's not necessarily automatic. We might need to demonstrate our utility to both earn it and to keep it. And the better prepared we are, the more thought we've put into it beforehand, the more likely we are to be able to both keep ourselves at the table and, importantly, to safeguard animal welfare as well.
Thank you very much. Wow, so what a great breadth of opinion and things to think about. I suppose what I'd like to do now is start by posing a question to you, but please use that as a prompt to ask questions to either the panel as a whole, and I'll redirect it, or a particular panel member. So I suppose going back to what we started with, asking you to think and have a show of hands, what responsibilities do you think veterinary professionals collectively have in this space, or is it just down to individuals? What are your thoughts or questions based on that premise, or indeed anything that's been mentioned already? We've already got some questions here. So there is a roving mic, so please raise your hand. And if you don't mind, when you ask a question, it'd be really nice for everybody if we're all friends together. If you just say who you are.
Hi there. My name's Emmy Barker. One thing that I didn't notice the panel kind of touch on, and I think one thing that we can do is support each other, because one thing that has certainly changed over the past 20, 25 years is social media. And I remember foot and mouth kind of outbreak when I was going through vet school, and I remember the massive slaughter of cattle by my colleagues at the time as students. Does the panel feel that a similar use of students and vets is going to occur in the same kind of way, with the number of animals being slaughtered, with the current levels of social media that we have, and the pillarisation of colleagues for taking part in such activities?
Gosh, who wants to come back on that first?
Anna,
Would you like to come in first?
I mean, I think the first bit of the context for your question is that I think, in particular, Ellie sitting at the back there would be very optimistic that we're not going to have such a late diagnosed, highly contagious infection, which is going to drive it to be on the scale that it was. You know, that was has been almost unique in high-income countries over more than 50 years, and I think that this is acted as a global warning. You might question whether the warning's been listened to in North America, given the way that H5N1 has been ignored in their dairy industry. But beyond that, I think the first thing is that I don't think we expect things on that scale. So that scale of slaughter, I think we would all be optimistic, given the improved planning that I think that now exists, at least in the British Isles, should help us to avoid things being as devastating on that scale, requiring the recruitment of people who would not normally be doing this sort of stuff as a day job. But I mean, Ellie I'm sure could comment further in the most informed way, but other panel members may also.
In fact, can I chip
Please
in, Chair?
yes.
Very, very close to my heart, as you can imagine, and I still get emotional thinking about it. I might slightly respectfully disagree with James a little bit, because I'm not sure that things have changed that much that they wouldn't see that again. I don't think we'd see the level of slaughter again. I hope we would vaccinate to live and use other techniques. But I think what alarmed us in 2001 was that the previous outbreak had been in 1967, and there had been the Northumberland report, and we didn't pay a hint of notice to it. We thought then we didn't have the technology we've got now, but we had mobile phones and we had pagers and things like that, and we thought this will be better. But it wasn't really that much better. I think we didn't learn the lessons. That's one of my concerns, is that the collective memory is now going to fade for those of us that are still in the middle of it, and we won't. It was all about speed and response. But your point is absolutely true. We didn't have social media then. Can you imagine if we'd had pyres burning with social media like we do now? It wouldn't happen, would it? But it also goes back to my point. You're absolutely on the money. I think we need to know exactly what is important for the government for each of these diseases. At that time, we got confused about how many animals were dying, whether you could eat vaccinated meat, whether it was more important the tourism that we had in the Lake District, whether we should be protecting that rather than farming, how are we going to feed the country. So I think we need to be very clear, and there was a new, the latest contingency plan was delivered from DEFRA in October 2024. And it's accurate, but there are still some commentary in there around speed of response and addressing concerns around human health, around tourism and so on and so on. I think we need to be absolutely clear with each other from day one what we're trying to achieve with these disease outbreaks, and therefore we can then put a plan in place round about it.
Did anyone else want to comment on that particular question? Yes, here.
Pamela Singleton. So I'm not old enough to remember the 1968 foot and mouth outbreak, but I am old enough to remember being taught about it very carefully at vet school. And so I did also get involved in the 2001 outbreak, and two of the key points of the Northumberland report were bring in the army immediately for logistical support, and ban all animal movements immediately. And I don't think it was so much lack of collective memory, I think it was political, because the Prime Minister of the day didn't want to be seen to be having this crisis. That was my impression, and I'm sure people could have different points of view on that. But he didn't ban all animal movements, with the consequence that all the sheep and all the movements that the farmers had wanted to do, they quickly were moving animals around. And incidentally, I think that contributed to the TB, but we better not go there because they didn't do pre-movement testing. So I just think if there is a big report like the Northumberland report, it was almost like we didn't learn the lessons, and then they had a lessons learned inquiries. But what can you do practically to make sure those reports are active? It's just like a load of hogwash every time. I'm sure you...
Did you want to come back on that, David?
I could talk to you all afternoon about foot and mouth, which is not fair. But what I would say, just to back you up, nothing happened until Tony Blair came to Carlisle with Alistair Campbell. He saw the mess. We had Brigadier in the room, and he basically said to the Brigadier, there's my mobile phone number, and you've got a blank check, get this sorted. And that's when the army came in. You're absolutely right. I was on one of the 3 government inquiries after foot and mouth, the Royal Society inquiry into infectious diseases. And I was reading that again before this panel just to refresh myself. And a lot of those lessons are still key. I think government has listened, but I still think we haven't clearly identified what we're trying to achieve, and I think we haven't necessarily got the manpower. If it happened again tomorrow, how many veterinary professionals, how many private vets are going to put their hand up and say, yeah, I'll go to Chester, or I'll go to Norfolk, or wherever you need me to go to deal with this disease? You know, we have got some resilience in place, but I'm not sure that practitioners are going to be able to turn out in the numbers that we did in 2001, in which case, who's going to do the work? But I don't want to hog it on foot and mouth.
Does anyone else from the panel want to come in on that? With your army experience, or the red teaming and...
Well, only to really reiterate how important the why is at the very beginning of the planning, and understanding that you're always working towards that outcome, as well as having these other thoughts in mind, such as the animal welfare, etc. That's it, really.
So I would only want to add one thing, and that is from the research perspective, I do think that there is some activity coming through national funders now, through UKRI, for example, who are running a lot of calls on tackling epidemics. And a lot of this, I mean, I've sat on a couple of the panels, and it's really nice to see, for example, networks being put together that are looking at things like combining epidemiological with economic modelling, so that you're able to provide advice about, in scenario, disease X, what are the relative cost impacts of shutting down or not shutting down, culling or not culling, or whatever the scenarios are. And I think, it would be nice to see more of that happening from, learned societies or through research projects where you get facts and figures to look at what's actually happening. Because, with COVID, as we know, there was a total mess when it came to working out what was going to be better for the health of the country generally at population level and at individual level. But up until now, I don't think there's been a lot going on, but there is, I do see some shoots of this within what the national funders are putting money into.
Thanks, Fiona. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Ellie Brown, Deputy Chief Veterinary Officer, and James sort of called me to arms really to join in this discussion. So a few sort of reflections given what's been said. So David, I take your point about clarity of aims. That report is overarching sort of broad disease control, and I take your point about having a clarity of ambition and goal. But I think there's also the need to be prepared for the unknown, because diseases change. So those aims might and could change over a course of disease outbreak, because you don't know how it's going to go. So those things might need to change as the disease picture changes. That unpredictability has to be part of our preparedness. And in terms of the role of vets, I mean, we are a private sector, and we have to rely on the profession to come together in times of crises and adversity to provide some of that backup if we need that. So, I think about some of the comments I've seen from small animal vets being frustrated. They're seeing the blue tongue, alerts, and I think that's a shame, because this is so important for our, collective profession and how we respond together. I think there's another thing, an impact, going back to your comments about how we support each other. I still think we're quite siloed in how we think about what we do, and also the animosity between different sectors. You know, I think the government's vets are still seen as, you know, the bad boys, or why would you do that? And actually, you know, I've heard on the panel, which is great, respecting experience and expertise, and I think we should really focus in on that too. And then the last thing I would add is, you know, the role of us as vets in supporting our sectors. So one of the big issues with foot and mouth, or with, you know, blue tongue now, you know, and could be an issue going forward, is movements. You've mentioned those, but also animal ID. You know, moving sheep without proper ID. You know, and dealing in those. I mean, those are massive risks for the disease control. That there's a great opportunity to us as vets with our clients to make sure that people realise what the risks is. It's not just cutting corners. Actually, it's fundamental risk to our whole sectors, their sectors, and us as a veterinary profession from that sort of behaviour. So I think there's a number of ways that we could work together on disease and preparedness.
Thank you very much. There's a gentleman next to you. Thank you.
Michael Clark. I'm a poultry vet and spent most of my time in private practice. Really I can understand the concern about foot and mouth disease that David mentioned. I can remember being a temporary veterinary officer during 2001, and I'd have concerns about how we deal with foot and mouth disease in the UK at the moment, especially with blue tongue and 2 clades of avian influenza circulating in the UK. But to go back to what Ellie is saying, I'm an optimist, and I can see the good. And when it comes to the poultry side of things and notifiable disease, I think we work really, really well with sort of government and the private sector, and those vets in the private sector then working with vet schools and industry. And so a good example would be that those decisions we have to make about vaccination for avian influenza, and it's a decision that will be made collectively. Government will ultimately make the decision, but huge input from the pharmaceutical sector, private vets, the poultry bodies as well. And that just seems to be a good thing. And then that sort of emerging side, of course, you know, we have avian core group meetings running at the moment, where part of the discussion is about cattle in the US and what's happening with recovery of avian influenza virus from udders of dairy cattle. And therefore what's happening in the UK, well, there's UK cases of avian influenza, but associated cattle with those outbreaks are being tested. And that's just, you know, crossing species, and that's, you know, poultry vets then working in conjunction with cattle vets. And then there's that, the final point I wanted to make is actually that change of, you know, going back to what we were all taught. We were all taught that avian influenza was an exotic notifiable disease. Is it now an endemic disease in the UK? So that's just a change. And if it is now an endemic disease in the UK, we'll be okay, because there's us, and that's the upbeat bit of it. Thank you.
Thanks for that comment. Just as an addition to that, you mentioned that how well, you know, government and private worked well in that scenario, that particular example, and across the sectors. Do you think the sufficient structures are in place to enable that, or does it just sort of happen rather ad hoc?
It happens probably ad hoc, and we're really, really lucky in the poultry side that, yeah, there's 1 billion broiler chickens a year produced and 40 million laying hens, but there's only 224 members of the British Veterinary Poultry Association, government vets, private vets. We're a small club, which makes it easy, much easier than it does on the ruminant side, for example, when it comes to disease. So it probably is ad hoc, but in a nice way.
I suppose the question is, I won't answer that question, but, you know, do we rely on luck and ad hocery? You know, is that sufficient? Yes, gentleman here, thank you.
Pete Orpin. I'm speaking as behalf of the chair of the technical group of Action Group Unis. We started a programme in 2009 which really sort of was based on education. And then by 2015 we structured it around the reset model, and then we swapped the letters round. And if you're not familiar with the reset model, I think it's a brilliant model, really. So the first thing we did was education, and then create a social norm. And then we used economics and tools to try and sort of influence behaviours. So social science was a big part of the programme. And the other part of the programme was a predict and prevent strategy. So the use of risk rather than test prevalence, because we have tests of poor sensitivity. And combining these factors and getting everybody on the same side, we were able to control the disease. And so we've halved the incidence in the last sort of 4 or 5 years, which I'm very proud of. But I think the question I have for the panel is, you know, James's comment about the predict and prevent approach. because I think we've got to get ahead of a disease. It seems little point, basically, trundling all the modelers out once the disease is hit. You know, surely we should have a system where we can actually sort of punch in the risk factors and kind of predict where the disease is going to occur, and move to a situation where we introduce surveillance on herds based on risk, based on prevalence, rather than on region or on other sort of crude metrics. We surely can move to a better system now for both the human population and the animal population.
James, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I suspect I'll be the first of a few people coming back to you. Peter, thanks. That's a really, really great question. And I think that actually the Johne's disease example that you've just described very briefly is a great example of what you can do for, I describe it as an endemic disease, where you can get farmers to take control of the disease that effectively they own with their cows when they've got it. And I think that's something that there are a number of other diseases from the same family of organisms where getting farmers to take control, giving them greater flexibility to aid their self-control is a critical thing to try and do. And that in itself for diseases which aren't just under government or statutory control is probably the key element in terms of ending up with an outcome that is successful rather than a kind of a continued grumble. But I think in terms of prediction and modelling, I mean, I think it's great. It's my day job to an extent, you know, spatial models of risk prediction and so on. But I think at the same time, one of the most important things to recognise with that type of very clearly analytical approach is to understand a lot of the uncertainties that exist around disease occurrence, particularly where you're looking at disease incursions rather than things which might spread from where they are. And in a way that bovine TB is quite predictable. We know that 55% of herds that have had it in the last 3 years will get it again in England. And that's the major predictor that allows us actually to do exactly what you've described. I think for a lot of other diseases, be they avian influenza, be they blue tongue, you might have clear ideas of very crude regional identification of risk, but you can't predict because of the uncertainties and the noise in how disease comes in. It's actually impossible to usefully predict. The key thing, and I think Ellie touched on it here, is to make sure that the plans that we do have are dynamic enough that they can respond to whatever or wherever the threat is. I'm just finish by saying I think one of our greatest protections, and it'll be the heart of your Johne's disease program, I think, is biosecurity. And I think that we need to think far more carefully about what good biosecurity looks like in all sorts of different farming systems, be it around animal movement, which obviously is a major driver of a lot of cattle diseases, or simple behaviours around what you do with your gumboots and your clothes in relation to what goes on a poultry farm. We can do far more in that respect in the absence of any fancy disease planning, and I think there's a real area that we can improve there, which is going to improve human and animal health, and actually therefore animal welfare as well, and human well-being, because there's a major stressor for farmers to have disease outbreaks on their farm, which isn't good for anyone's well-being.
Yeah, thank you, James.
Sorry, long-winded.
There's a question there, Richard.
This is going to sound a bit airy-fairy after the severity and the seriousness of things like foot and mouth, but I wondered if we should apply the old Donald Rumsfeld quote to this situation. We've got horrible knowns of blue tongue, etc. We've got the known unknowns of organisms crossing species boundaries. But have we got, if not a red team, maybe a blue sky team, sort of thinking about the unknown unknowns? I guess BSE sort of falls into that. Came out of nowhere, I think, you know, and a class of organism that we don't sort of really understand even now. Have we got anyone working on some really out there ideas? And if not, can I volunteer?
The disease X scenario.
That's it.
Yes, please do, David. Yes.
I think that's a great point, and I tried to touch on it before. We need to know the background noise of disease, the normal levels, and we need to know when a spike's an important spike. So I believe it was Colin Whitaker who was the vet that was accredited with picking up BSE, but it was only picked up because a few practitioners had seen a strange condition and mentioned it to the local VI centre, and somebody went, hang on, there's something happening here, what's this? And that worries me a little bit, because we don't have as practitioners, we don't tend to have that relationship with the VI centre the super VI service that we used to have. Now, I know that we can do a lot with data and we can do a lot with AI, but we have to be asking the questions of, what is this? When do we get a spike? And you're absolutely right, it's the unknown unknown, and Ellie touched on it before. We have to be light on our feet, but we also have to be able to know how quickly we respond, and if we do respond, what are the key drivers for that response. You've talked about the bird table, Tiffany, haven't you? And that was one of the things we learned in Foot and Mouth. I'd never heard of a bird table before, but when you actually got all the relevant authorities and stakeholders around one table, it's an army-driven impact, isn't it? But then you can start sharing those decision-making points.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you can even come in earlier, which I think is your point, is to actually brainstorm what could happen, what are the potential. You could even think about some random fungi infection, for example, which could be your point. Who knows how to treat fungal infections? I don't, but somebody probably somewhere does, and probably know exactly how we would deal with that. So I do think that forming some kind of group and working out what are the potential scenarios and what are the different stages of that, and what are the so whats on each of those, and how does that matter practically. And I think really importantly, especially with the way the profession's gone in the last 30 years since I qualified, how do we communicate with the public, and importantly, and I think that came across over here, with small animal vets who maybe, I think Elle said it, actually, who don't necessarily consider themselves to have that much to do with food-producing animals, even though horses are a food-producing animal technically in my book. But that's very controversial, isn't it? But it's very difficult to think about these things unless you're willing to have a conversation and really make yourself ridiculous. To really say, well, why can't this happen? And someone else will tell you why not. But you need to all get in a room together, and I think vets are very well placed for that because we have such diversity of experience, not just across the clinical arms of the profession, but across people like those of us at the table.
It's funny you said that about fungi, because my nightmare scenario is fungi killing all the earthworms. So, yeah, that's ridiculous.
Or the bees, killing the bees.
I was just coming back on the fungus, sorry, just to add, that has actually happened with a disease called chytridiomycosis. There has been this fungal disease that's known as the most, the worst infectious cause of biodiversity loss and extinctions in the world. And again, it was a vet actually in Australia that had that. And the same, I suppose, with West Nile virus, and it was a vet at the Bronx Zoo. Becky, did you want to come in on that? And then, sorry, there was a hand up. Sorry, yes, do you want to go first? Yes, sorry, and then there was a hand up behind you.
I've got to declare an interest because I just finished my Masters in One Health. So I suppose in a way, for my dissertation, I really looked at the data collection in human cases of avian influenza. And to give you an elevator pitch, I kind of agree with a lot of what's being said by the panel, but I also think we really need to look more at kind of, for instance, what are the transmission pathways? What are the potential treatments? What are the kind of factors in the humans that actually make them ill when in contact with a viral disease? So when I looked at that, and I looked at what the organizations had in terms of protocols, and I looked at the kind of data collection in human case reports, it was awful. So there was the data collection on the humans was not very good. There was not much about what level of bird contact there had been. Had there been contact with diseased birds or not? There was hardly any evidence of any kind of data on the environment at all. So was there a temperature change? Was it cold? Was it hot? Was it humid? So I think my question is a little bit more about kind of what we should be doing is really looking at these diseases and kind of look at some of the core questions we have about these transmissions, treatments, and risk factors about these diseases, because otherwise there's no hope that we can actually come up with really evidence-based mitigation strategies. As we did with COVID, we were in a mess, as you said, because we really didn't know about what the source was, what the transmission risk was, and treatments and all those kind of things. So actually, I think we need to almost go back to first principles with a lot of these diseases. And that's where the One Health becomes very important. So the human side is reasonable, but actually the environmental side of things and the animal side of things is really not interacting at all. So I think if we want to make progress, really, especially in the zoonotic side of things, we really need to get a much more collaborative approach to get a better outcome.
Thank you. That's a common theme that's coming out in this collaboration. Yes, there was a question behind. Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry.
That's all right, Anna. A slightly different tack. I mean, I picked up on David's comment about where the vet sits in the middle of the Venn diagram, and I like that concept a lot. And Tiff touched on it a little bit too. But do you think that politically our position is recognised with the powers that be, what our expertise that we have around, for instance, even in this room, and the relevance of the veterinary profession, or are we just looked at as animal doctors?
Excellent question. David, did you want to come back on that? I'm going to ask you.
Thanks, Nikki, for throwing me into that one. And I don't want to hark back too far, but at the time of Foot and Mouth, Jim Scudamore was the CVO and the Chief Medical Officer were on the same level within government. And there was a decision at that time that the CVO became more delivery rather than strategy, and the Chief Scientist seemed to get more involved. I don't think we are seen at the heart of it. I think we all have a role to do. I'm just more involved with BCVA these days, and I wonder whether people like the BCVA on the cattle side, Beaver on the horse side, the SAVA have got a role to get our voice heard more loudly, especially when we're talking about zoonotic diseases or these big incoming pandemic risks.
Can I brief with that? David, I think that's a really interesting perspective. And I think one of the challenges is that most of us aren't exposed, and this touches to your comment earlier about clarity, and it's not clarity or transparency or understanding of processes. And having chaired DEFRA's Scientific Advisory Council Exotic Disease subgroup for a few years, up until 2 or 3 years ago, one of the things that impressed me actually are the plans for dynamic responses to deal with exotic disease outbreaks, and including, in particular, bringing in of experts with relevant knowledge and background. And so I think that not everyone in BCVA or any of the other divisions will know that, but I think there are people, smart people sitting in the middle who will be ready there to recruit them into some of these advisory groups straight away. And there are very clear processes within government, and we saw it operating I'd say quite well compared to most other countries with SAGE through the pandemic. And actually those processes are in place to bring in the expertise, but you don't know that you'll be asked.
I'm not so much talking about the expertise, I'm talking about the conduit between the profession and the members out there who are actually delivering some of this stuff and the public. And I'm not sure that's as joined up as it could be. No, I'm sure that the communication is really hard around that, and I'm sure that's right.
Yes.
So I'd go further in a slightly different direction as well and say that if you're looking at a disease that's affecting humans and animals and you're trying to identify it at its earliest opportunity, in an ideal world you'd have the doctor and the vet talking to each other, and actually that doesn't happen at all. And in fact it's worse than that, having worked with a lot of doctors, or had a lot of doctors work for me in the army. They don't ever consider more than the patient that's in front of them, even the public health ones. Think about the patient that's in front of them rather than automatically thinking, oh, I've got a case of scabies, and asking, oh, have you got any other animals that have got scabies? Or has anybody in the house got an itchy skin lately? Or where have you been? How might you have got this? They don't think like that. They just think, oh, I've got a case of scabies. This is how I treat it. It's a very different perspective. So how do we get that conversation going? If things are being picked up and are interesting, how do we get local doctors and local vets thinking, oh, we've got a pattern of something going on here. How do we sort of talk to each other? What are the opportunities to talk to each other? Because I'm not sure they're there at the moment.
So, yes, we have a question here.
Can I just move on to the unknown unknowns that we were discussing just then? I just wonder what the panel's view was on the potential for, perhaps, for being prepared for disease outbreaks, following on from the introduction of precision breeding, as it's called, by which they mean gene editing, and the impacts of that, which of course is now beginning to take place in farm species. in order to increase productivity driven by money, 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 profit, 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 and the potential for changes in background genetics, which certainly I've done a lot of work with research animals with mice, and those impacts and changes in genetics can have unpredictable side effects through more than one generation, and how we're going to control that, and possibly will that lead on to changes in disease susceptibility and spread of disease, and how we're going to think about that.
Gosh, that's a huge question. Does anyone feel capable to tackle that one?
So I think the point about precision breeding, which I think it's a shame isn't going to be allowed to be taken forward in animals, is that you can target single genes which are demonstrated to be very helpful in reducing susceptibility to disease. And there's a very good example of something, and I'm not talking about the broader consequences of the salmon industry, but the salmon industry, some would say, have been saved by precision breeding. It's been or a single gene that's been introduced into salmon that make them resistant to infectious diseases. So actually, yeah, precision breeding can change susceptibility, and it can be positive. I also think we've got to be terribly careful, as you just described it, build on our knowledge of laboratory animals, where there are unintended consequences, but most of those lab animal strains have been produced by methods other than precision breeding, certainly if you go back over time, where lots of different genes have been modified. In many cases, you don't really quite know which ones have been, you just know the one that has been. And I think that's the difference between modern precision techniques and some of the more traditional ones, because you can just target one gene. But we've got to be very careful about that. But I think there are real opportunities there. It's not just about risk. It can be about improved welfare as well as money.
Thank you. David, did you want to come on?
Yes, Sarah, as you know, when I was I'm still in practice, but when I was actually had my welly boots on, I was very interested in advanced breeding and genetic improvement. And I think it's a very valid point you bring up, but I also think we can use these techniques, particularly things like IVF and embryo transfer, to speed up improvements. So, for example, we're involved at the minute with a project with SRUC where we're selecting low methane cows, so cows that are producing on exactly the same ration, but they produce low methane genetically because of the biome, and we're selecting those cows and we're amplifying those genetics, not through any manipulation of the gene, but just by breeding techniques. And I think there's a lot to be said for that, by breeding longer living animals, more productive animals, ones that need less intervention, lower methane, higher food conversion efficiencies. I think there are techniques that we can use there, but I think you're absolutely right. We have to be careful we don't gallop too fast up the wrong lane like we did with Scrapie, for example. And I think there's also got to be a lot of discussion about whether we're doing gene editing or gene deletion or what we do. There can be a lot of advantages if we use genomic. We're just scratching on genomics, as you know. We're just scratching the surface. We've got all the epigenetics to understand on the back of that. So we may well know what the genome looks like now, but we don't know what's turning on and off these genes. So I think it's a big conversation to be had, but I passionately believe we should be using these technologies to improve the livestock that we have for the sake of the planet.
Thank you, David. Okay, I think there was a question over here.
Thanks. Thank you very much, everybody. I just wanted to sort of a comment, and it really was prompted by the reference to amphibian chondromycosis that came up. Just wanted to say, because we're talking about veterinary profession and our contributions to disease preparedness within the One Health context, I understand, of course, that the vast majority of our attention will be around threats to public health and things that pertain to animals within captive settings. But just to kind of nod to our veterinary profession also having a role to play in threats that are to biodiversity, principally only, particularly in light of understanding how anthropogenic stresses often, or drivers, are responsible for those, and understanding the context of so many international examples now, often by fungal pathogens. White nose syndrome in insectivorous bats in North America would be a classic example where there are knock-on consequences that not only influence ecosystem health, but have direct influence on public health in those areas. So I'd just love to see it always being framed within One Health, that our interests and perspectives are around threats to people and animals in captive and free living settings. So it's a bit of a comment and a thank you to everybody.
Thanks, Becky. I think that goes back to what you said right at the beginning, James, about biodiversity as the biodiversity loss as the driver of a lot of this. I wonder if oh, sorry. Yeah, you need to wave
a little bit. So my name's Ian Battersby. As the committee's been highlighting, this is a One Health issue. It's a complex message. I think we all have to acknowledge. I'm learning about different aspects that I don't even consider on One Health just in this room today. One of the challenges with One Health is, the very much actions we take now are not short-term beneficial. They're kind of in the distance, in the future. And ultimately, with a lot of these things, whether you think within the UK or globally, there needs to be a political will for this to happen. And the challenge that we have is that politicians, obviously, they're going to react to political will, a population, public will and desires. They're going to look for vote-winning opportunities that are more short-term than long-term. So for me, I think, as a profession, we have a responsibility to educate not only the public, but also politicians on this. And I guess, for me, my question is, how do we as a profession, as a fellowship, as individuals, how can we push that agenda, this One Health disease outbreak preventing, how do we elevate that on the agenda that it is politically important to address?
Thank you. You were nodding there, Fiona, and I know you're not a vet yourself, but you're very much in this space, and you're talking very much about veterinary professions and wider and communication. Did you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I have practically no experience in the UK. That's the problem. But I completely agree with you. That kind of science policy interface and just sharing a common language, being able to communicate clearly is incredibly important. And certainly with the work that we've been doing, in some countries like Bangladesh, for example, you'd think it would be much more difficult, but actually it's much more straightforward, because what you tend to find is that there's a huge crossover between the vets there who are working either in public or government labs or out in the field, are working cheek by jowl with livestock officers and public health officers, often depending on the area. And I was very struck by your comment about human and veterinary doctors not talking to each other, and that's not the case in most low and middle income settings. Actually, it's a much easier interaction. It doesn't mean there's not other problems, but when it comes to political will, there seems to be a more collective bargaining, if you like, between the different sectors. The problem there always comes with resource. There's no resource, and people, and I'm sure it's the same here. Departments and sectors tend to guard their pots of money, and certainly, we talk about One Health, but we don't talk about one wallet, and that's very important. That when you look at the amount of resource that goes into animal health compared to human health, it's a very difficult argument. And yet, why is there so much livestock? It's because people like to eat animals, and it's about sustaining nutrition and the human population. So public health completely relies on animal health, but that message doesn't carry a lot of political weight. And I think we're facing tough times at the moment. I mean, we're waiting for spending review at the moment, and not sure, there's a One Health interim settlement at the moment in terms of the science budget, but this new government's got a lot of challenges, and putting money into science and research and animal health may not be top of the list, So, yeah, I completely agree, but no answers, but I think, we have a role to play in being rigorous about the evidence that we generate, making sure it does cover the piece, that, as this gentleman said, that you're not just talking about reactive, but you have to be proactive and needing to think about, yes, there will be a disease X, and yes, there are pockets of research, big pockets of research actually, looking at exactly the sort of risk factors you're talking about, but it's not very joined up. And those pieces of evidence often end up in academic publications and don't end up on the tables of the people who really need to see the top level message. And we have a job to do to make sure that we don't just publish, our results in some journal or whatever that, 20 people will read, but we're actually kind of putting it out into a bigger setting when we need to.
Thanks, Fiona. Yes, the lady next to you.
I'm fascinated by the idea of mapping and being at the table. I think that perhaps in order to deserve the place at the table, we have to do exactly what you said, which is, as a profession, decide what outcomes we think we have a role in. So maybe we say welfare. If there's anything to do with animal welfare, we should be at the table. Then we map those outputs where we think this is a real risk and we want to be at the table. And then you present that and you say, if you have any of these things happen, you need to call us because we've got expertise and we've already mapped what we would do in response and we can help you with that. That gets you the place at the table. And the place at the table, the outcome that I'm concerned about, and I think this is a known, is that we have more incidences of heat waves, heat stresses, more incidents of flooding. There are government documents for what farms should do if they're, but are the vets helping with that? Are the vets involved in that? What happens if a whole town gets flooded out? Because people are going to be worried about the people first and the animals second. And I'm drawn back to my old colleague's experience in Indonesia after the floods, and he went out on, I think for BSAVA, about a week after the floods in Indonesia. And he said, well, they were either alive and doing all right or dead. So actually there wasn't much of a welfare problem. Maybe there wasn't when he visited, but 10 days later, 2 months later, when there's no food, and you're getting disease outbreaks of diseases that we know about because of poor sanitation, because of poor nutrition, because those animals aren't being tended, because the vaccination regimes aren't as they expect. That's happening. We know that's happening. What are we doing as a profession to say we need a seat at that table? So I love the idea of that mapping so that we can actually say this is where we should be at the table, and actually this is where our interests are secondary. Don't involve us. You'll cope. Sage will be all right without the vets on this one.
Okay, that's provoked a response here.
I was just thinking from a seat at a table point of view, we do seem to be treating livestock species very differently to the companion animal species, which is the area that I tend to work in. And we're quite happy to import animals into the UK with zoonotic disease. And we're quite happy to import food into the UK to feed to animals containing zoonotic disease and feed it. And yet there seems to be very little appetite from a governmental point of view to arrest that. I'm just wondering whether the panel has any ideas as to, should we be treating companion animals in the same way as we do livestock? Were they to get Mycobacterium bovis? Is it okay that we're treating them with triple antimicrobial therapy to cure them for it? Or should we be mandated to euthanize them? At which point do we really look for it in those species if we know we're going to have to euthanize them?
Very good question. Does anyone want? That's more. Yeah.
So my first job in research was spending 6 months looking at the possibility of BSC getting into sheep and goats. So I was working at then the Central Veterinary Laboratory. Now obviously it would be part of APHA, and shortly after I started doing this work. And we were very interested in new instances of scrapers around 1990 or so. So the kind of height of the BSC epidemic. And then scraper was made notifiable. Eradicated the disease more or less. So I think we have to be very careful. And actually I've seen something very similar happen with the introduction of legislation around equine arthritis virus in stallions. We have to be very careful of the unintended consequences of legislation. Controls and legislation are good, but sometimes good, proactive, sensible measures driven by science and the private sector can be much more effective. And it doesn't answer your question, but I just think we've got to be really careful of unintended consequences of yet another law. And there's not huge, I don't think there's great appetite for another bit of animal health legislation about pet food or anything else at the moment. And I think this is where actually leadership from the profession and calling things out which are really crazy. If we're seeing outbreaks of disease that are caused by an infection, as has been seen probably in this country, but certainly other countries quite recently, then let's do that. And I think that should be our first line approach to these things, and really try and influence things, because we can actually influence through leadership in a clear voice what happens in the private sector, at least in some of this country, if not all of it, or these countries. And I think that would be my baseline, first line approach, rather than thinking, well, we need a law for that because it's wrong, because they can often have counterproductive effects.
Thank you, James. I suppose I'd like to, I think this has been really interesting so far. I think I'd like to pick up on a few things there. And we talked about, those One Health conversations and focusing back on the profession and things that we can do. I'd like to pose to the room and to the panel, how can we start to have those meaningful One Health conversations, in our day-to-day roles? And then maybe we'll talk at the end. I'd like to talk about what the profession can do as a whole and how the fellowship can help. But in our roles as veterinary professionals, how can we start to have more of those meaningful One Health conversations? Yes, gentleman here.
Yeah, that led very nicely into a comment I was going to make. I only ever hear One Health discussed in a veterinary context. It's only vets that are talking about One Health. Now, that's slightly unfair, I know. But Tiffany said, the doctors don't think about population health. They don't think about zoonotic disease. My concern is that we sit in rooms like this. We talk about the importance of vets, of veterinary public health, influence in One Health, and what we can do for human health, the planet, the environment, and obviously animal health. But we're not talking across the profession. Somebody over there, I wasn't sure who it was, said, other politicians are aware. James told us that there are plans in place to get vets around the table when needed. But should we as a fellowship be reaching out to the other relevant Royal Colleges of the other medical professions and as professionals be saying, this is what we can bring to the table, how can we work with you? If there's an outbreak of scabies, for example, and I understand we've seen these in certain populations recently, of course we need to be looking at the animals. We know that the majority of new infectious diseases in the human population are coming from animals, but I'm not seeing these high-level, genuine One Health conversations with that epidemiological input that we should be getting across species. So I guess my challenge was, how do we as a fellowship start to make that happen rather than expect politicians to do it or our medical colleagues to do it, because frankly they're not going to. They're not taught about population infectious disease. They're taught about oncology and things because that's been the focus in recent years. So you talk to medical students, they have very little understanding of the things that our veterinary students take for granted.
Thank you. Excellent question. Who would like to come back on that? I mean, globally, just as a starter, globally, obviously, there is a lot of talk about this. We've got the One Health high-level expert panel. There's lots of conversations and things going on globally. But you're talking about what can we do as this profession, and are the right people in the room? So yeah, Tiffany, would you like to?
So I'd say it depends on what country you're in, and obviously we're in the UK, but in the States, if you work for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, I think it's that way around, isn't it? Prevention and Control, CDC. About half of their epidemiologists are veterinary surgeons, and the other half are medical doctors and paid twice as much, by the way. They do the same job, side by side. Most state epidemiologists fall into those two categories as well. So they work much more closely together, and they've got, I think there's more of an opportunity to talk together about what's going on, and I think they've got more chance of spotting patterns potentially. I think the same is true across much of Europe, where you've got vets more involved in food safety and other factors. Less so here. In the UK, I think we've become a profession that's seen as looking after small animals, and then there's a few people that do large animals, and it's, when I say I'm a non-practicing, I'm not a clinical vet at the moment. People are horrified. Well, how can you be a vet? Well, I'll always be a vet. I just don't do clinical work currently. They can't quite comprehend that. But to come back to your point, I think there's potential to engage with the other Royal Colleges. So maybe the Faculty of Public Health, for example, which isn't actually a Royal College, I don't think, but they would be a group that I think would be open to having a discussion around how do we look at some of these things together, how might we spot patterns earlier, which I think is at least a first conversation.
Was there another comment?
It's a comment, not a question. But I relatively recently applied to be a FRC path, specifically for this reason. I really wanted to be able to have some kind of professional area where I could meet medical pathologists and try to have that animal health and public health perspective. And at that time, I suggested, wouldn't it be great to have FRCVS and FRC path co-events? So it sounds like a great idea to me.
Does anyone else have any comments or ideas about how we can have more sort of joined up One Health conversations?
I think that there are lots of joined up One Health conversations. The Royal Society of Medicine's comparative medicine branch has been doing this for years. And so there are lots of people who are doing bits, but it's pretty piecemeal. And I think there's not a systematic view of this. And this certainly happens within. I don't want to stand here and be an apologist for government at all, but there are actually committees specifically designed to do this within government with combined expertise from APHA and UKHSA and so on. So I think there's a lot of this stuff is happening. I go back to David's point that it's not all clearly externally communicated, and it's certainly not understood. And I think that one of the things the fellowship can perhaps do is help with this communication piece. But I think there's also a lot that we could collectively do more, because there's always more to be done in this area. But we talk about being in the room. One of the problems is that there are so many different rooms now, and actually in many cases we are in the room, but it's just we're not in all rooms, and individually we're certainly not in all rooms, but collectively, actually we are in many of them. And I think this is where being more joined up about this, perhaps being joined by the fellowship, can be a way that we start to improve our understanding and improve our communications of all of this. So I'm not arguing for a lack of improvement. I think there's far more we can do, but I think that one of the great challenges around this space is actually understanding the massive range of different things that different people in this profession, not just in the fellowship, actually do already in this area. And there is quite a lot, I think, but it's not enough, but there's more than we know, I think.
Yes, comment over here.
Yes.
We'll wait. No, we want as many people to contribute as possible.
Hello, my name's Amy. I work in First Opinion Farm Practice in Essex. So as you can imagine, we are sort of the sentinel area for anything that flies in on a midgie. And I wanted to speak to what you were saying about being in the room, because most recently I'm part of a VDP practice, which means we deal with outbreaks. We do a lot of work on AI, and obviously we've done a lot of surveillance and report work on blue tongue by virtue of where we are. And recently I've sort of found myself in the room, sort of at DEFRA, going to being drafted into core group and the vaccine task force. But it was totally by accident, really. And I was only there because Senior Vice President at BVA couldn't be in a meeting and thought, who else could possibly be useful in this scene? All right, Amy works in this area. And when I was in the room, someone noted that I was the only practicing vet there, the only person that was actually living and working in the restricted zone. And in my naivety, I was just a little bit like, oh, well, surely every sector that is potentially affected by a disease should be represented. So I was there as a camelid vet, because no one had sort of had a chat about how the camelid calendar works, and it was all beef and sheep focused. And I said, well, surely we should have all these representatives. And they said, oh, the thing is, the group is so big that we just can't invite more people onto it. And that struck me, because there's experts everywhere and everyone has something to say, but I think we also need to recognize when we are not needed in the room and when we are taking up space, and I think we as fellows can be like, okay, I'm not the one for this job, but I do know someone who is. And by doing that, we elevate our fellow colleagues, and we bring them into rooms where their expertise is noted, but they wouldn't necessarily be speaking up for themselves. So I wanted to
That's a really good point.
make the converse point there.
Yeah, thank you. You are the fellows. Does anyone else have any other views on the role of the fellows? Yes. Oh, Ellie again. Yes, sorry, there's one there.
Thanks, I really like that suggestion, and also the one earlier about what can the fellows of the Royal College do to, make contact with equivalents in other Royal Colleges. I think that's a great idea. I just wanted to highlight, there are opportunities now. The health mission, we have been looking at animal health within that broader health mission, and that's sort of, massive cross-government piece of work, and how we think differently about human health. And then, we're certainly looking, me and Christine, at how we link animal health into that bigger picture. Obviously, the COVID pandemic has really changed mindsets in Westminster on disease control and the importance of it. You know, it's one of the few good things to come out of that crisis. And the number of times I've spoken to ministers and they all understand what R0net is now is amazing. So it's, you know, there are changes, and I think the political and ministerial sort of group and a cadre of people are listening. And so, you know, if there are things coming from the vet profession around this, I think, you know, there will be people listening and want to hear what you have to say, we have to say, and you know, we might be pushing an open door in some places, so just to flag that.
Thanks very much. And there's a comment here.
I just wanted to back James up on the fact that these things are happening. I sit on the APHA Scientific Advisory Board, and I think the Disease Surveillance Intelligence Group are one of the ones that are really trying to link into the profession. They have species expert groups that they consult on a regular basis. I attended their conference about the sort of outward-looking approach that they're having and learning from what's going on in other countries as well. I think one of the barriers is actually linking up data across government agencies to understand what's happening in the animal field and what's happening in the human field. And I think if we're going to campaign on anything, it's really that. Those agencies need to share their data, and at a country level, that would make a big difference. And I think there are some barriers to that, but I think they are gradually being broken down. That's my impression in any case.
Thank you. So we're going to have to start to think about wrapping up. We've got to be back upstairs at 4:15. But certainly I think I've got a very strong message. I think we all have that the fellowship should be more involved, and I haven't got the answers as to exactly what that would look like, but certainly as you know, you're vice chair now, we can talk to the fellowship and as the science advisory panel in terms of how we make that voice longer. I suppose I'd like to sort of go back to one of my initial questions of you as individuals here is how do you feel, has anything that has been said today changed what you feel you could do individually to contribute to disease preparedness and delivery of this One Health agenda? Has today sparked anything in you? I'd like to hear from you. I think all the panel would like to hear from you about your views now you've heard the panel speak. Any thoughts about that?
I'm going to come chasing you for more ideas about what the fellowship should be doing, because you know, this is the specific area that I'm going to try and be working with Neil on, and I think, you know, the ideas we've had this afternoon would be fantastic, and yes, thank you all very much for that. But it's,
yeah.
Sorry.
Yes.
Well, I've got a comment. There's a job for James, I think, really, if it was the new vice president. I remember the 67 foot-and-mouth outbreak and the 2001 very well. I remember how the Northumberland report was completely ignored by the politicians in 2001. When I worked in New Zealand in the 70s, if there was a foot-and-mouth outbreak, the senior vet had more power than the Prime Minister. So in other words, the veterinary profession was put completely in charge. So I wonder if the fellowship should perhaps be lobbying government to install that situation in this country.
More power. More power.
Who could deal with a foot-and-mouth outbreak properly.
Let's put Ellie in charge. That's a fantastic idea.
Yes, the gentleman here.
Can I just add to John's comment? I think this is the first time for a long time we've had two vets who are sitting MPs, which may give us an opportunity.
Thank you. Very good point. Yes. That's true. Okay. Did anyone else from the floor want to make any other points? Because then I'm going to put the panel on the spot. Yes, Ellie. Final comment.
Something that I'll take home, I think, is like engagement with doctors. I mean, I've been reaching out to my CMO, Deputy Chief Medical Officer counterpart, but I think there's more perhaps we could support locally as well, so putting local public health and local vets, so that's definitely something I'll pick up with the DCMO and think about.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so in the last few minutes, I'm just going to go through the panel members and just ask them to sort of sum up their thoughts as a result of this afternoon's discussion and any sort of key messages they'd like to convey. So starting with you, James.
Well, when we were planning this discussion, I had no idea. I don't think any of us had any idea how well it worked, and it's been fantastic, I think. And so kind of credit to the room. And actually, I was serious. My point about picking up ideas in terms of how we develop the fellowship and how we think about the fellowship doing more, because then a lot of people have come here and said, well, what does the fellowship do? And I think actually it's for us to decide that. But I think it wants to be useful and not just trying to do stuff that other people are already doing. So I'm going to. That's a lot of what I've learned. Thank you all very much.
Fantastic. Fiona.
Yeah, thank you. I've enjoyed it very much, and it's been great to hear. One thing that I think might have been absent in the latter part of the discussion is we heard a lot about human doctors and public health and veterinary health. I think if there's going to be communication, that there also needs to be in that room people who understand human behaviour, people who understand community medicine and what's happening in terms of opinion, and also people who are capable of giving at least some level of sort of socioeconomic analysis, because I think it's very easy to focus on the technical and the clinical, but society doesn't just focus on that. It needs to be a little bit broader. So I would recommend that, or not recommend. I can't recommend anything. I think it would be great if it would expand to go into those other disciplines.
Thank you, Fiona. David.
That's the Fiona Bruce moment, isn't it? At the end, we're running out of time. I just want to thank you all. I've learned a huge amount. It's been a fantastic discussion. Thank you very much. But I would like to reiterate my point that we are trusted professionals. We are every survey that goes out there says how trusted we are. We're bedded within our communities. We're part of that local community. Please go out there and advocate. Go out there and advocate for climate change. Get out there and advise whatever species of client or whatever animal your species. Whatever species you're working with, whichever clients you're working with, please go out and advocate and use that power to make a difference. We as a profession can make a massive difference.
Thank you.
So I think two things have struck me today. The first one is the unknown unknowns and the opportunity for the fellowship to brainstorm using technical expertise to support that, so we can really work through how we might approach things before we have to think of it on the hoof. And the second thing is the importance and the opportunity that we do have to engage more effectively with our human health counterparts.
Thank you. Well, how about that? We're exactly on time. So all that remains for me to do is to thank the panel. Please thank the panel.